wanted to really take you back over the sort of 20 years of practice and to really try and explain the concerns that I've been interested in over these 20 years of practice. Essentially, when I started, I became very quickly, very interested in the idea that was there a way in which one could make practice without sort of building up a body of work which was in that sort of usual canon of a sort of biography that was trying to reveal certain tropes that would be repeated around the world or adjusted around the world. I became very interested in this idea of how much invisibility could one make as an architect and how much visibility could one make with form. In reversing these two positions that are quite traditional in architecture of trying to find a signature but trying not to find a signature, it allowed me to investigate and to explore a way into projects and to create my biography through the projects, but not through the sort of narrative of the signature form. And that has been an ongoing work, and I draw my creativity from that way of working. And what I'm trying to do is to not simply be a schizophrenic person in each condition, but to almost work out what is the operation of the theater of the work. So how does the work come into being? What are the forces that bring it into being? And how does creativity shift the potential to make form in the world and to have that form have impact in a way to reset and reposition the ability of architecture to engage with its contemporary conditions, but also to be able to engage with the widest audience that I may be dealing with. I'll start with a very small project and then go into 4 big projects. I'm going to show you, I think, 5 projects. And a project that's very dear to me was a small pavilion that I made in Gwangju for the Gwangju Biennial. Some of you, I'm sure a lot of you have been part of it. What's amazing about Gwangju, of course, is that it's an architectural biennial where the work doesn't go away. There's a certain kind of power in the way in which the work is a constant accretion to the city that permanently adds to its evolution. So not only are people building, but also there are these experiments, and the experiments stay. And somehow there was something very beautiful about that for me in terms of making a project. And the then curator, Nicholas Hirsch, an amazing architect that I've known for many years, asked me and a series of other architects to pair up with an artist specifically to then make a work for the biennial. I wanted, at first, the instinct was maybe to find a Korean artist, but I actually resisted and chose a literary, instead of a visual artist, I chose an author, because in a way, reading about the history of Gwangju, which is that image, and its revolution and its incredible relationship to literature, I felt that there was something very beautiful about the way in which maybe in discussion with somebody who was a writer, one could start to envisage a different kind of collaboration. Taye Selassie, who at that time had released her book Ghana Must Go, was really talking about transnational ideas, about identities and shifting polemics. And so we were both strangers in this place in Korea, and really the idea was really to see if we could find a project. We were left to make our own project. In the end, what became the inspiration was this structure and the kind of absurdity of the modern world and a kind of notion of memory. What you're looking at is an image of what the city believes are traditional Korean structures for viewing landscape that are reconstructed and placed within the sort of infrastructure of the city, and then a piece of sort of incredible infrastructure to negotiate getting from the main street down to the waterfront, which becomes the park, the bucolic aspect of this very hyperdense city. We chose to remake that structure as an idea, but to think about it through the lens of the histories that we've been dealing with and our kind of rereading of the context. So we used the budget of the city to make a bridge, stare down, and then to make a pavilion structure to then create a new space that would be an open library, a library without walls, The idea really was to place itself within this incredible literature culture where the book is revered. People leave newspapers folded beautifully on benches if you've been to Gwangju, and other people read it. There's never a kind of trashing of literature, which is a very interesting cultural idea. So we thought, is there a way in which we could make an open structure that really the library would take over, the community library would take over, would fill with books. The first set of books were 200 books by Taye, chosen about the history of Gwangju through her eyes. And then it would then become a swapping site where people would be able to take those books, of course, and bring other books, and to just see what would happen over time. Really just an experiment. And then this would be marked by the pavilion structure, which would be above. Then the simple thing was to make the structure in two parts, cast concrete below and a timber sort of loggia above. The concrete sort of worked with the datum of the floodplain so that it's sort of the 500-year floodplain would never go above the concrete cast structure, so it could be completely submerged in the future, and the pavilion above it floating. And then this would just be this form. And the experiment was to work with the lowest budget and just to cast very roughly the base, and then to work with the carpenters in Korea, but not to kind of try and craft anything, but to try and develop a system where we just would order a way in which they could pin joint to then make complicated forms. Very simple sort of constructional exercises, but the scale, of course, was monolithic. This is, you can see the background of the entire sort of urban condition, the street, the waterfront, which is turned into a sort of park, a sort of wetland. Everything happens, riding, fishing, walking, and then the sort of density of the city with its sort of hyper construction to do with the kind of numbers of the city. And then this idea that is in Korea, the sort of, hyper control and hyper sort of lack of control by the waterfront. So this is a bridge formally, so everybody's supposed to take this, and there are no railings or safety guards, and everybody understands how to use it. And then the form really is, the structure is kind of placed at that axis so that it becomes this moment where you have this new sort of problem, which is the structure which is playing between these different issues. When you approach the form, here it is in its context. It's either a simple stair or it's a place to stay. It's obviously Wi-Fi'd, and you can see the books are left in there by different people. People come and rest. People perform there. Events happen there. The mayor uses it for events, etc. And it's just a structure that's around, and obviously architects visit it, etc. It's then sort of taken on its own life and has operated sort of since then in the city, sort of adding another quality, an ambiguous quality, a sort of way in which form can figure in a space to create a sort of opportunity which is neither about a pavilion nor about a project, but a place of opportunity and to see what it could do. This is from above. It's deliberately incredibly low to deal with the sort of ideas about landscape and revealing form, which is in a lot of Asian sort of relationships to garden space. And actually, when we finished, the city later brought one of these structures because it's a program that they were delivering. And even though we felt that we'd sort of reinterpreted enough what we were doing, well, we clearly failed because they put the traditional structure back. And so we have the dilemma of the double at the end, sort of summarizing this exercise. Number two was a project we completed several years ago in Beirut. Those of you who know it, one of the sort of those beautiful cities, really in the 50s, 60s, really seen as the sort of one of the great cities in the Middle East, called the Paris of the Middle East, whatever that sort of terminology means. But anyway, an incredible city by the waterfront, incredible trauma fracture from the war, and then an incredible amount of rebuilding, considering it's next to Syria. This sort of small city of, now 2 million people is an extraordinary hive of construction and optimism with this incredible fragility of war next to it. My client approached me to build on this site. This is an area and part of the city on the way to Byblos, which is kind of one of the great ruins in Beirut, if you know it, which is the 5,000-year-old sort of city that still is in existence now. And the site was really an old fuel and sort of industrial sort of zone. He put up a temporary structure for many years and managed to rework with the city to rezone that area. And what he wanted to do was to bring his, he has probably in the Middle East one of the largest collection of post-internet art sort of from 2000 onwards. He's got over 10,000 pieces and is seen as one of the most significant players of that work, of that sort of period in the world. He wanted to make a museum for the community. He wanted to share the collection, but also he's in the fashion world. He's a big fashion retailer. That's where he made his money. And so he also wanted to have his commercial operation next to it. And he said to me, David, you know, we can make 2 buildings, one for the museum and one for this, for the shopping mall. And I said, no, there was something very interesting about this paradox of these 2 conflicting ideas, and through, you know, in a way, sort of in true sort of Warholian sort of premonition, this idea of retail and art coming together seemed like a funny but interesting, dangerous mix to try and test as a composition. So I said, why don't we try and make one single form, but try and make a hybrid structure, something that I'm always interested in, a hybrid structure with a kind of singular identity. And then let's also make a public place for the city. So what we were able to do was to work with the city to make a land reclamation on the waterfront and to create a sort of a water break and a sort of a space for people to be able to come to the city, because since the war, the idea of public space has become very contested. There are military everywhere, but somehow using this program, we could create a secure space that families could come to, and mothers and children and students, etc., and create a public space that could be right next to the water that wouldn't be dangerous, but also create sort of another kind of space. I thought that I was very interested in the sort of the obviousness of the Red Sea, the rooseness of water, and you know, I set my team testing how to kind of abstract geometries out of water, because I was fascinated by this idea of seeing if we could work to invent a new form from that image to play with this old idea of the traditional mahrabia. So this is the plan in the end. You can see the site plan with the new plaza, which is really the project. His existing building is a smaller lump, and then the rectangle is the large art and retail space. And so in a way, the building for me is an excuse to make the space and to pass through the plan of the building as a gateway to the space, and the passage through it really splits the building and creates a public space. In a way, in each project, I'm also trying to contest and figure about the way in which the reduction of the public realm means that buildings have to perform in a new public way, and how do we operationalize that within architecture? How do we find new ground, literally? So traversing through the center is this axis, which is almost turning the building into a gateway, one side art, the other side retail. And then the retail is identified with a sort of very large modulus type quality, a sort of urban room. The atrium, which in retail is usually about what you see, is turned into a spectacle of light, which, you know, fought with all the retailers who thought this was going to be the worst mall ever because nobody could see any products, and now it's probably one of the most popular places for the community. And then the art space with its double cubes on the other. So this is the building and its context now. You can see the small brown volume to orientate you, looking back to the skyline. And what you have is a kind of very car-like operation where the cut is a ramp down and an entrance in, which creates the relationship to the sort of axes of the building. And you can see how the traffic really is this extraordinary band that, you know, it's a kind of slice of what you see in LA, but probably more intense, that sort of goes back and forth to the city. And then this is this idea of the gauze that sort of embraces the multi-program of the space. So in the end, we also put a health space on the roof, so that there's swimming and health and body. So that this idea that somehow in a space after war, you can find a building which can give you reflection, mind, retail, and then this idea of this sort of wellness building, a sort of 24-hour building that wouldn't require you to kind of have your security or all the other issues. This is the atrium in the center, sort of opposite that, which is a hyperspace, and it's just really working with reflectivity and natural light being dropped in and artificial accents. And then the retail spaces kind of come through that, but always through it, you're always reminded of the relationship to the form that's the sort of figure of the sort of body, which is the ocean. And then this idea of a kind of layered aluminium colored sort of system, making a thickness through layering, which then creates the environmental climatic control and also creates the sort of signature of what the building becomes. And then through it, you literally pass from retail through these very tiny slots, almost incidentally, into these vast caverns of art space, where the collection's on display between small spaces and large spaces that sort of overlook, and that is over 50,000 square foot, sort of working parallel with that. So you move through these spaces, and then you arrive on the roof, and this is looking up through those moments where then you kind of rise up. And then you have this moment of the spa with all its facilities, and this pool overlooking the city. And then in the ground floor, you have restaurants, and then the plaza. And then the plaza that we sort of made with the ability to have the waterfront come crashing to it, and now it's become this very sort of important and popular place in the city, and then the building in its context. Next, I'm going back to nearly a decade ago to the sort of the first major project, large project that I made in Russia. It was a big international competition. It was my first big international competition win. And it was for a management school in Russia. And it was at the time when Medvedev was president, and there was this little window where it felt like Russia was coming out of the Cold War, and there was a lot of work and projects. And we were one of the few architects that managed to build our project. A lot of projects got canceled at that time. And it was really about making a private-public partnership with sort of Russian institutions and the private sector to try and make a business school that would celebrate their sort of managerial excellence. And ironically, this was the first school, we were surprised, that was going to be, all the other schools in Moscow were private schools, private business schools, and this was going to be the first school that was going to be sort of run part by the government and part by the private sector. The site is on the periphery. If you know Moscow, it's a sort of enlarged version of Milan in the sense that it's a series of concentric circles that radiate out. It's not a medieval city, but it's a giant sprawl. And the yellow are the incredible arteries that lead right to the center, to the Kremlin, if you know the way that plan works. The site is a 27-acre site. And we sort of won the competition by really basically making this very simple analysis that if you look at the bar graph, the amount of time that it was going to be out of snow and looking like this was going to be maximum 4 months, and that it would look like this most of the time, and that we didn't want to, we felt that this was the reality. This is 10 foot of snow the first day I arrived there. We wanted to make a building that would understand this context as its everyday and not to force the institution to be shoveling snow on a quad campus. Most of the other schemes did the precedents that we know from Jefferson right through to East Anglia, looking at the model from the monastery right through to this idea of the campus is always an unfolding set of buildings in a landscape, bucolic. And we said that in Moscow, because of this climatic condition and also their cultural tropes of this extraordinary experimentation in architecture, maybe there was a way to make a piece of architecture that we all, obviously as architects, love, using constructivism to try and make a hyper building, but also not just using constructivism, to also look at the traditional architecture of the churches, which are these very large volume buildings with a sort of micro idea of a city above the major span of the architecture, and to see if we could try and make a new type of campus building, which was a hybrid compressed stacked. Rather than using all the site, we'd use the smallest footprint we could and release the rest of the land to be a park for the university. I talked about abstraction and the power of the lessons that I draw from about the way in which West African and Central African abstraction and fractalization has been going on for 500 years. Some people call it privatism. It's actually a kind of not. It's a kind of an abstraction about organizing complex systems. And the building really in its diagram became about creating that large volume space with the schools and then a series of pavilions which are in a way a sundial. They really operate by organizing, because it's the first building in this context, there's a whole campus of new buildings that are in the different parts of the park. The place is becoming urbanized. It was a suburb. I felt like if this was the first building, in a way, it's had to kind of perform this geographic sort of relationship of maybe becoming a kind of panoptic system that could actually talk about where you were and also what orientation was here. This is looking at the site with all the kind of construction consolidated into the red volumes, all the program that they required, except for the gray, which are the villas for the professors, and then an energy center which had to be out, even though we wanted it in, but we lost that battle. The plan of the building is a raft concrete structure. It looks like a steel frame structure, but it's actually a raft concrete structure, no piles. It has a 3-meter deep foundation, which sort of anchors it because it's a 1,000-foot diameter, 300-meter diameter building, and that was enough to just stabilize it. We worked with Russian sort of post-war engineers who were amazing at dealing with concrete in the cold weather and taught us how to make this building. We couldn't do it actually with the engineers that we traditionally brought from London. And what we did was to say that we wanted to see in this very vast 300-meter volume building a way in which there were no dead-end corridors, that wherever you went to a dead end, it was a window, and that it would also organize itself according to the light. We had a 3,000-seater auditorium, a 500-seater auditorium, and then the 5 different schools, which are different subsets in it. And those would be north in the northern aspect, and then the rest of the school would be in the southern exposure, so that the apertures would also register the light. And then the building would just work. Red is really the school's daily program. You'd park underneath, rise up. The residences were in one single bar. Because it's also the private sector, the auditorium had a 5-star hotel next to it and then connected it through to the big auditorium and its own VIP drop-off. And then the staff had their green path, which was also the way in which the communities of the building could move across and interact. This is the building in its context. You know it. So it's, even though it's a concrete cast building, it's clad entirely in glass. These are some amazing images by Iwan, who sort of took these for us. And the form of the building, I mean, there's a new car park. We try to put all the parking underneath, but the place has become very busy, and this is a recent photo that we were sent recently where they've kind of made this new car park, but this is looking at how the building footprint works in its context, and then when it's in its landscape, you can see how it operates. The perimeter is a jogging track, and it has a sort of landscape, a sort of artificial landscape in between the hotel bar and the residences, and then the light blue bar is the administrative library headquarters, and the gold building is west-facing. This faces east, the other side is west, which is where the, sort of, as I call it, the body part is, which is gymnasiums, swimming pools, saunas, etc., for all the MBA students in the main disc. There's an ability to be able to walk all over the building, and to obviously in the snow drive underneath it, rise up into its centers. We designed only the main buildings, and then the rest of the kind of sort of spaces were done for us. We designed the auditorium, which has a kind of large sort of light. And then the sort of idea of these black cores which come down with these large skylights, that sort of ovoid skylights that kind of organize the way in which you move around the spaces. And then the interiors were done by sort of Russian interior designers. The way the building works is that the in-between space is profoundly important in that it basically is the place where all the relationships happen. And so you're in this sort of endless loop that never ends, that you keep going round. And then there are schools off it, and then these vistas to the windows. So I explained. And then the classrooms are able to be divided, either lit or unlit. And then you see how this is looking at the residences, where there are 3 floors of residences in that bar, which cantilevers over the form, and then you're able to go into the sort of this is an Olympic pool that allows for the Olympic team to train here, a gymnasium, and then the sort of garden space with its forms. And then the school has been graduating students since 2010, sorry, and then the building and its context now. 2 projects more. I'm going to take you to a project that I'm working on now to give you a sense of it, and I'm going to end on the Smithsonian. This is a project that we're doing right now in Ghana, which is quite a controversial project right now in the country. But essentially, in Ghana right now, there's a very interesting sort of agenda of using architecture and building we have a leader who is very interested in building the nation and using architecture, because he's a lawyer that actually spent a lot of time in France, and I think indirectly was very much influenced by the Mitterrand years, but has gone back to Ghana and is very interested in the idea of using architecture as a way to stimulate an image of the city and growth. We were brought right into the center to work on a series of projects. I'm really talking about the cathedral project, which is this red bar, which is really probably the monumental core of Ghana, where there's this, the Parliament building exists in the conference center, there's a park, which is a cemetery of heroes, and then the Black Star Square, where independence was sort of celebrated on the continent for the first time, the first country. So it's a kind of very important monumental core, and at the top end, the president wanted to put a space for not secular, sort of a space for the sacred of the nation, but he wanted a space, really a gathering hall where important funerals, deaths, etc., which is very much a staple of Ghanaian culture, West African culture, sort of operates, but to see if we could also reinvent that building type and see if we could make it something which adds to the national life and reimagines this central core, which is a bit invisible to a lot of people, that this road and this axis is profoundly important. So we came up with a project of basically we doubled the site and said we can make this building, but also maybe we can reimagine this landscape as a park with this building in it that deals with coming from the main trajectory into the city, into this red bar, see that as a new national space, imagining, after sort of decades of poverty and just sort of simple infrastructure building, making a national space as a kind of arboretum garden for the nation and for everyone to be able to come to, the building as a free space, but also to add to that program of this idea of a cathedral, not just being a sort of cathedral, but maybe it's also a museum. We put in a museum, a music school, a facility for conferencing, and then smaller Baptist sort of baptistries and chapels that are also part of the function. So it's a kind of moment where the sacred and the profane kind of interact. This is that main axis that I was speaking about. That's the site that I was talking about. This is the main axis in Accra, Liberation Road, and this is Castle Road, and Parliament is back here. This is the parliamentary buildings built in the 60s. And obviously this is just images of that idea of identity. This is the time when the sort of famous six sort of were talking about independence on the continent. The architecture of the 60s, ironically, in 7 years, Nkrumah was able to build most of the kind of infrastructure of Ghana, which we know now because he was overthrown after 6 years by the sort of coup that happened. And most of that infrastructure still is the main frame of what is in Ghana. And in Accra specifically, but also all over Ghana, the fragments of them are still the kind of profound buildings that are still resonating. And in making this building, I wanted to see if we could find a kind of, obviously, Christianity in Africa is a very hot button. And I always argue that Christianity in Africa is not obviously the Western idea of Christianity. It's another mutation of the Christian thesis. It's its own kind of DNA. And it works through a sort of lens of a combination, in my mind, of the sort of traditional religions and revelations of the culture and Christianity. Even though that's never admitted, I always am struck by how that is profoundly it. Most churches are really based on the Bowerman pageant, in the sense they're about the way in which people meet and kind of organize each other, but that's done through music and hymns and sort of Christianity, and Christ is the kind of figure that is in the center of it. But if you look at the traditional culture, the Bowerman culture, which is this revealing of the kings on the weekends, they call a day called Kwesida, there's this idea of making architecture through fabric, and this idea of a kind of pageantry of fabric enclosures that create the space and create the kind of system. That became a big inspiration to see if we could use that as a way to think about how to make the project. And then I invited 6 very prominent artists from diaspora and also in Ghana to work with me on various aspects of each of the project, from the altar through to all the kind of key spaces, from painters to sculptors who are working on different aspects of the project. So this is really the idea that in the way the project creates the spine, finally, that articulates this monumental core, and that the building is maybe it's a 40-meter wide by sort of 180-meter wide long building. It's essentially a convention hall because it holds 5,000 people but can extend to 20,000 people through its terracing as an outside space. And I wanted to really play with this idea of a series of awnings that are placed on props and that as you got closer to the center, the awnings, as it were, elevate up rather than sag, as it were, almost supernaturally elevating to acknowledge the center. And it's a very simple diagram, and then they are basically on a plinth, and then the plinth organizes all the other program. And it's an arena, it's a democratic arena, it's an amphitheater that you can come onto, and then you have this kind of moment where also that plinth allows you to see Accra in its context. So this is an elevational study of the building and its garden. The hall, which is quite vast, with its sort of leaves of folds of concrete. The elevation on Castle Road, so this idea of the hierarchy of the building. The section through it, so looking at the way in which the plinth organizes museum and other programs, and then the upper space is this great hall for the nation. And then the way in which it just organizes itself, this is just a quick access to take you through the different programs. So this is looking from conference center, chapels, to museum, music school, etc., through to rising onto the mezzanine to the main auditorium hall, and then how that is then enclosed with the 5,000-seater space, but then either side being the spaces that can be, the facade collapses so that either side has these sort of abilities to have these sort of seating systems that come through, and then the form of the building in its context. So when it's finished, this is what it makes. It creates this axial system. The gardens are organized as a series of concentric sort of arboretum sort of systems of looking at different landscapes from the country. And then as you rise up onto this podium, which is about 15 meters above ground, you get this extraordinary view of understanding how horizontal Accra is and this sort of new structure which will sit in it. And then just early studies about how the space will work. There are no columns. It's a column-free space. It's 40 meters wide, so you can imagine these are kind of these extraordinary trusses working with Albert and AKT to develop this extraordinary technology. It'll be the first superstructure built like this on the continent, and really talk about a kind of new way of making architecture on the continent and the capabilities of the continent to deliver a specific architecture for its own agenda. And then lastly, the Smithsonian, which was built, finished in 2016. The Smithsonian is a project of really, in the end, completing the monumental core of America through the establishment of the final sort of museum. It was planned by L'Enfant, an amazing architect who used the Beaux-Arts strategy to develop Washington, but then developed the monumental core as a series of sort of a very simple diagram of culture, memorial, and the executive, and then surrounded that with all the other sort of key buildings of power, Congress, National Library, etc., and then a series of memorials that are on the Potomac River or near the Potomac River, and creates this kind of extraordinary landscape. The last building that has been built is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it was a 200-year sort of struggle to get this project built, even at the last minute after a lot of discussion. There was a debate to not have it on the Mall, but to have it at another site. It was actually because of President Bush at the time. It was one of his last presidential wishes to allow this project to happen on the Mall, and that took it out of Congress so that it no longer became a debate, but it became something that was just the decree of the president, and nobody could argue against it. So in a funny sort of way, it's always interesting for me to explain that first bit. There are about 200 African-American museums all over the country, trying to kind of deal with this issue, but none of them supported in a way with the kind of weight of the Smithsonian. The museum is a new kind of museum. It's obviously not an artifact museum in the traditional sense. It's an artifact museum which has the providential power of history, sort of loading it rather than value or spectacle. So, and then there's a lot of late post 20th century archive of imagery and photography. And for me, it's always beautiful to show these images where one I'm always asked, well, how does a British African boy know about and make a kind of architectural project in America? And I'm always talking about how, that it's very important to understand that the African American sort of explosion that happens sort of in the Harlem Renaissance right through to civil rights is the modernity of the black community. It's really a kind of a singularity, I think, in the sense that it shows how these worlds are interacting and how these very key figures are all interacting with each other and erupting a new world order out of it. Freedom for the continent of Africa, civil rights in America, and birthing human rights right now. So this is Adam Clayton Powell, this is Malcolm X, this is Martin Luther King with Nkrumah and his team debating. They went to school together in California, etc. And as I said, the provenance of this museum is things like the first voting slip of the African American, of an African American sort of family, or obviously the horror of chains of slavery, or a hymn book of resistance. And of course, this idea of the diaspora and its relationships to the continent and understanding that is really important and clearly illustrated in this map that I love from the Du Bois Institute about how the slave trade was really very methodological. It was commercial, so it was really mapped in terms of numbers and quantities and impact, but not in terms of what was lost in terms of identity, cultural specificity, and nuance. South America, of all the slaves that made it, South America had about, I think, 9 million slaves. The Caribbean got 3 million slaves, and America only got 500,000 slaves right at the end of the slave trade, which is now the community of nearly 40 million African Americans in America right now. So it gives you a sense of understanding how that works. And in that project, because of its sort of relationship to the site, I became very interested in a way to create a fiction story that was my story, but also the story that was about trying to find a way to create a rejoining of the rupture that happens in the 15th century with slavery arriving to the continent and the extraction beginning. And I sort of romantically wanted to look at the Yoruba, who were probably, to put it within a European context, I was sort of like the Greeks of Africa in the empire building times of the 15th century. They were the most skilled craftsmen. And so I became very sort of fascinated with this idea of kind of going back to saying what would happen if that rupture was not about extraction and amnesia, but was about memory. What would the architecture be now? And so I became very fascinated with the caryatids of shrine structures, which are the sort of devotional structures to problematic stories, but also to this idea of labor in that the African American community's entire sort of relationship to America is about labor in service of the big idea. So everything from architecture, canal building, the parliament, the city is through this. And for me, its register in architecture is really in the ironwork of the cities of the South, where a lot of slaves were casting these ironworks by hand because when people couldn't afford the factory-produced castings from the North, the slaves were taught to just make them by hand, and they became very good at it. And there's no irony for me that there's a relationship between the Benin's and their bronze works and timber works of the South and the way in which we think migrants have no skills, but actually there's these incredible people that were being brought to America who were actually in the majority building the country, literally with their skills. This is the location of the site. So really it's it's probably hard to, obviously the panoptic moment. It's the last site that can be built. It's half the size of all the traditional sites. But in a way, that for me gave me a clue as to how to develop this project rather than becoming a palace in that sort of traditional neoclassical sense. It also strengthened my argument about wanting to make a new kind of museum. And I sort of argued that you do what most museum people tell you can't do, which is to go down 80 feet and then to rise up about another 80 feet above the datum line, so 160 feet, as a museum experience. And that was important because that was the story, to literally physically bury people into a space with no light and to lift them up into a space with light and to use that as a way to really discuss how this building would support rather than just be a vessel for the content. This is a building in its context. So the building in the end is also a study with a sort of hybrid program with this skin system, but the skin system is also now the circulation trajectory that wraps around it, and also the framing device which organizes certain specific views to command and reframe the context. In a way, the building demands that you relook at Washington a new way through the lenses that it operates. We set up 9 lenses to the context, but it also kind of creates, at once it creates disarming hospitality and then traumatic perception. You have moments where I wanted to recreate the idea of the porch, but obviously now it's by the water, And it's this moment where we were able to reduce the temperature by as much as 7 degrees by just using the water and this inclined plane and disconnecting it from the building. So the stack effects work by coming through and releasing from the back. The building is the last moment before the mall, so in a hot summer sun, it's really a very much loved space. The main hall is empty. It's just a space for the city where the sort of natural lines of the city are allowed to still pass through. There are 2 doorways. And then you drop down into the main sort of 40-foot chamber, sort of cut on the sort of north-east-west axes. And that's where you queue to go into the history galleries, either down this large stair or through elevators. And then you go down into the history galleries and you go through a very compressed space, and then you arrive in the main hall, which is this 80-foot chamber where all the stacks of history are played out to you. All the objects in this library, in this museum, are real. There's nothing here that is a sort of simulacrum. And when there is a simulacrum, it is clearly made not in any realistic form. It is just, cast as a neutral form. And everything else is real. And that is a critique, an internal critique, but to really talk about the other African-American museums which spent a lot of time trying to recreate reality. So they're almost Madame Tussauds, what we'd call in England Madame Tussauds waxworks museums, of a sort of reality show of a horror without any of the smells or any of the kind of actuality of the evidence. And really, in a way, kind of warps the way in which one is able to understand the history. Everything here is from the rings made from broomsticks, which are one of the most beautiful things in this museum for me, of early slaves, right through to the first houses made by freed slaves. This is the segregation trains, which this train sat on a disused yard for many years and was bought by the Smithsonian, reconditioned and brought into the building, sealed. You come up a series of levels. There's intimacy for certain specific programs. There are very traumatic moments talking about lynching and all the kind of civil rights areas. These are all dealt with. There are moments where you have Emmett Till's coffin, which the family don't want to be photographed, but it's a very powerful space that you come into. Or recreations of the lunch counter, but also using technology to bring the history to that experience of sitting. And then as you go through it, you sort of rise through 3 tiers and you come to a moment. A lot of people are very traumatized by the time they've done that first part of the museum. And then we made this moment as a kind of reflection space where you go up into a chamber with this 30-foot room where water is pouring very loudly in this space, and it's a reflection on the words by Martin Luther King. And then you sort of look up, and then you rise up into the light spaces where you then go into the exhibition spaces, which then talk about the migration from the south into the urbanized north. And then you are kind of in sort of historical relationships with the site and the content, military, etc., culture and arts in the roof. And then these moments where you have these extraordinary sort of vistas to sort of the key monuments. This is a moment where you see the White House and the administrative sort of corner of the Federal Triangle, and then a sort of panorama window over the memorial grounds of the mall, and then the building sort of in the front again, maybe at late day, and then at night when it's lit. Okay, I think I've taken enough time. I'm supposed to do a talk with you. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we can take a few minutes for discussion.
Okay.
And I thought because, to try and keep this as tight as possible, I'm going to suggest 3 points about identity. Come back to the theme of identity, which is the theme of the festival, which you might like to comment on in order. The first is resetting cities, because of course Washington is about being reset. It's about saying the African-American experience, or African-American work, labor, intellectual and physical, was a foundation of the state, but it wasn't properly recognized. This building is a way of expressing that. It's very interesting that it was Bush who insisted on that, and that is a way of recasting Washington. But also, I think Moscow, in a strange way, far less dramatic, far less obvious, far less central. You're recasting the city, and also, of course, in Accra. I mean, the National Cathedral and the way you showed them out. So maybe you could just say a bit about resetting cities and whether it's possible to do it on a small scale as on a large scale, obviously with less impact.
Yeah, no, I think that, especially speaking about this notion of identity, I think for me, identity is not interesting when it is about reinforcing sort of obvious narratives. And for me, when one is talking about maybe I like to say this, the narrative rather than the identity, but if you're talking about this notion of identity, I think what's interesting is that architecture is able to become a form that is able to push a certain sort of justice into the equation. And I think it's an opportunity where architecture can move past just being in the sum of just building parts, but also can be a critique about questioning motives and agendas, but also create, in a way that I think that architects are responsible in that they work for a client, but they also work for the idea of the city, that they're always indebted to kind of make sure that city is giving the best back to its constituents. So I'm very interested in the way in which, even at its smaller scale, even for me, the Gwangju project is a device to talk about how any moment can be an opportunity to go beyond just the material excellence of construction. Because if that's all we're making, for me, I'm very worried about a world of similarities, of kind of confluencing expertise and a kind of an elitism which is to do with, you know, hyper commercial liberalism and who controls money. I'm more interested in the ability of architecture to be the kind of arbiter of ideas and to be the device that can negotiate and become a system where money has totally corrupted the ability to make a sort of meaningful form. If you look at the modernist project, it's all about money now, and in architecture in the West, it's absurdly expensive. Projects now cost billions, and it's kind of crazy. If you're able to sort of shift that and maybe make something else, whether it's small or large, I think this is a very interesting sort of moment. And for me, this idea that in that shifting, one is not really specifically trying to talk about a national, even though there are moments where there is a kind of national idea, I'm very interested in the forgotten stories. I am very interested in the notion of Rus and what is somehow, in the way in which people forget history or edit history, and that somehow for me, I'm interested in becoming a sort of using architecture to sometimes lift that uncomfortable or comfortable conversation so that it's part of something. So for me in Russia, you know, the conversation was all about neoclassical buildings and how everybody hated the brutalist buildings or hated the sort of constructivist buildings. They didn't want to see it. And it was a huge discussion to try and find a way to bring that project into it. And we used a lot of technical things, but also in the end, there was a kind of an argument with the board in the end was about, you know, trying to reach back to a kind of something which is forgotten about the Russian identity, that it's not all St. Petersburg, but it is also about this other trajectory, which is not an embarrassment.
Well, what was interesting about that was your images of the site, particularly when you went there in winter, and the milky sun, you know, the northern sun, which has a profound effect on what Moscow is like.
Completely.
And St. Petersburg to some extent as well.
Completely.
But Moscow is more, if I may say this, and I apologize to Russians here for bowdlerizing your culture, but it's more authentically Russian, you know, than St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
To
well,
me.
St. Petersburg is a kind of introduction of an idea that isn't local into a kind of, you know, to try and compete with a European city. And in a way, Moscow, with all its scars and its fissures, it has its, you know, all the kind of tropes of globalization and transnational sort of ideas through classicism. But it's also somehow got the sort of brutality of the real impact of every generation's intellectual and constructed form. And even though a lot of the residue in Moscow is deteriorating and people don't like those buildings, so they let them fall apart so they can build, the residue still exists and it imparts a kind of providential power, which I think is very important.
Sure. The second point I just wanted to briefly cover, is, you've alluded to it in what you were saying just now, is the relationship between story and identity. And story has to be personal. It might be the story of more than a single individual, but it has to be personal, whereas identity can be constructed.
Completely.
You know, and imposed.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could say a bit more about the relationship. And
therein, for me, is the kind of the difficulty, because I have no interest in identity, but I have a lot of interest in stories. It's interesting how it gets constructed into the notion of identity, and the idea of the nation state is the story of identity. It's a construction that's made to give us these sort of systems of bringing sort of a lot of difference under an umbrella, and it has worked or is now unfolding out of what it tried to do for about 100 years. And narratives for me stories are much more specific in the sense that the story is not beholden to some idea of correctness. And the story is really about that moment and that ability to bring something together from that condition. And that story can be explicit or implicit. And that story can somehow not have to be emphatic in trying to solve many issues. I think when that starts to happen, I think that there's a failure because the construction becomes, the fiction level becomes so high that I think it's very difficult to contain exactly what one is talking about when one is talking about identity, except for in the residue of the after effects of the construction of the narrative of identity.
But I think,
and I don't want that. I'm not interested in the after effects of the.
What's interesting about stories is that they can mutate, through an oral tradition, and they can also spin off into music or into other, dance, other forms of activity.
They're freer.
Exactly, freer, but they can set up a sort of process or a system or even a sensibility.
Totally. And what's beautiful about stories is that somehow encoded in the idea of the story is always the specificity of the place and the context. Somehow that is always embedded in the story somehow. That most narratives are really talking about the way in which a place does something to someone or a way in which a certain kind of atmosphere does something to someone and a condition does something to someone. It's somehow the kind of foundation of it all. And for me, that is a clue to understanding how to work with that. And for me, what that does is that it then allows architecture to be more precise in the engagement.
Yes.
I mean, and the precision is not about being accurate or correct. It's about just being precise to the story.
Yes. So it's confirming, but also reflecting on the story.
Correct.
Which is what the museum does in Washington. It confirms and reflects on both.
And allows it to then reframe.
Yeah. Final point quickly is that phrase, a paradox of liberty, is obviously very resonant, and all those high-flown Jeffersonian phrases, which were fine for maybe 50% of the population of the United States at the time. And that paradox of liberty, Jefferson and John Adams and others were trying to construct an identity for the United States. Yeah. But actually, that identity, awful, repressive, and tragic though it was far more interesting than they had acknowledged and admitted.
Completely.
And I think that just the final sort of quick point is the way in which a building can be a hybrid and can contain a paradox. How can that work?
Well, that's the beauty of it, that it's somehow flawed in that sort of way. It is not attempting to be like the founding fathers. That's what I mean by this idea of the myth of sort of creating an identity, because it is fundamentally flawed in its intent. I mean, it has a kind of universal utopia, which is kind of beautiful, but it is kind of fundamentally sort of fractured. And that works for the idea of the nation state, but for an architect, I think I find that it's a kind of fraught area to start to kind of go into, because you start to move into, I mean, other architects in the 20th century have attempted to do it, Adolf Speer tried to do it, and it tragically crashed. So I think that there is a kind of way in which if you fall into the myth of the sort of fictional identity, you go into very difficult areas. But I think that there is something about being able to use that utopia to question it and to always, or to put a mirror to it through narrative, which becomes interesting. So that in a way, architecture can also be involved in the activism of society to try and engage with the founding ideals that one might be setting up or not. I think that we're in an age where, because of the density of building, I think we have to find a meaning for building, for me as an architect, beyond just building, because I think then otherwise contractors can just do it all.
Yeah. Well, I think if I may, in my simplistic way, sum up, I think what you're saying is invent new and adapt existing narratives rather than get fixated over identity.
Absolutely.
And on that, I think we should close, because I know that Paul Finch is waiting to announce the winners for the categories this year.
Fantastic. Thank
David,
you.
thank you.